the Second World War turned the globe into a battlefield. Over 80 years later, the war is fast slipping out of living memory, but the remains of that terrible conflict can still be found all around us today. From mega bunkers to bullet holes, shipwrecks to cemeteries. I'm James Rogers, a war historian who is fascinated by these time capsules. They tell us the stories of death and glory, ingenuity and desperation. Now, for the History Hit YouTube channel, I'll be looking for the last traces of World War II. At the turn of 1942, after 3 years of almost non-stop victories for the Axis powers, things began to look a little different. The Nazi invasion into the USSR began to falter, stuck fast by the icy eastern winter. And the USA, provoked by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, entered the war on the side of the Allies. With the might of the US to the west, and a wounded but not yet defeated Soviet Union to the east, Hitler faced the nightmare position of fighting on two fronts. In response to this, on March 23, 1942, he issued Directive 40.
In the days to come, the coasts of Europe will be seriously exposed to the danger of enemy landings. Improvements of fortifications are to be so made that the main defensive effort lies in those coastal sectors that are the most probable sites for enemy landings.
The directive tasked the Third Reich with creating a bristling fortress along the Atlantic coastline. This was a static defence network that was meant to be impenetrable to attack. This was the birth of the Atlantic Wall.
Hitler's theory was that a defensive wall on the Atlantic coast would protect his flank facing towards the UK and the USA. This would allow him, in turn, to throw the might of his armies against the Soviet Union, defeat them once and for all before turning his attentions back to the West. This was to be an enormous undertaking, and in order to achieve it, he turned to his gigantic engineering organisation. Organisation Todt. Founded by ardent National Socialist Fritz Todt, he oversaw the biggest civil and military engineering projects in the Reich. From the building of the Autobahn to the Siegfried Line. However, the Atlantic Wall would be a project on another level entirely, and the man responsible for it was Organisation Todt's Franz Xaver Dorsch. The question was, where to start?
Nazi High Command were convinced that the Allies would need a major port as a gateway into Europe, so places like Ostend or Calais, or Esbjerg, here in Denmark. And so it was these ports that were bolstered with new defences. They were the first bastions of the Atlantic Wall.
These ports became fortresses, packed with men and materials to repel any attempt at capturing the port and allowing the Allies a foothold in Europe. But it became very clear to Nazi High Command that there were still vast swathes of undefended European shoreline.
To remedy this, Hitler ordered a new directive. He wanted 15,000 bunkers built along the entirety of the European coast, and he wanted it done in 7 months. An impossible task.
Hitler was now obsessed by his wall. Albert Speer, the Nazi architect, noted that Hitler would be up late at night sketching out bunker designs himself, remarking that his designs met all the requirements of a frontline soldier. Not wishing to question the Führer's wisdom, these designs were often adopted without revision by the Todt engineers. The west coast of Denmark has some of the best preserved remains of the Atlantic Wall. Stretching almost as far as the eye can see down the coastline, there are hundreds of bunkers right on the beaches. These pillboxes and bunker emplacements were built for a variety of reasons, some as forward observation posts, others as machine gun or anti-tank emplacements. One thing they have in common is that they are all built to a very specific set of rules. Regelbau. The Regelbau was a sort of instruction guide on how to build the bunkers, determining the thickness of the walls, position of gun ports, and the facilities inside. It meant that whether it was here in Denmark, up in Norway, or down the Normandy coast, they would be built exactly the same way, tested and measured to provide the right defensive and offensive power. The Regelbau also meant that these flat-packed bunkers could be erected quickly, with whatever unskilled labour that could be found in the local population. Whether forced labour or even paid local labour, the bunkers could be erected en masse. The bunkers were first made from wooden scaffolding, into which the concrete was then poured. Even today you can still see the impressions from the wooden plankings in the concrete. Once set, heavy metal doors and gun slits would be fitted, and the weapon systems would then be introduced, machine guns or anti-tank cannon. These would be the front line against any Allied invasion. Hitler and Goebbels were quick to capitalise on the new sections of the Atlantic Wall. They pumped out masses of propaganda both to the German people and their enemies. The message was clear. Germany was still a force to be reckoned with. Invade at your peril.
Hier zeigt Deutschland im 4. Jahr des Krieges die gigantische Stärke seiner Abwehrkraft. Der deutsche Soldat steht auf der Wacht. Er erwartet den Feind.
But despite the bold propaganda about the Atlantic Wall, in private questions were being asked about the value of the wall project. Albert Speer was concerned about the escalating cost. Billions of Reichsmarks, over 17 million cubic yards of concrete, and 1.2 million metric tons of iron in barely 2 years. Material and money that was being directed away from Germany's desperate armaments industry. There were also concerns about just how effective the war would be should an invasion come. Field Marshal Gert von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief of Western Forces, remarked that it was merely a propaganda wall, and pointed out that
it doesn't suffice to build a few pillboxes. One needs defense in depth.
Despite the efforts of Dorsch and Organisation Todt, by the May deadline only 30% of the 15,000 bunkers that Hitler ordered were complete. In November 1943, a new man took over the role as General Inspector of Western Defences. The Desert Fox, Field Marshal Rommel. Rommel was appointed commander of the Afrika Korps in 1941, and he had witnessed firsthand the Allies' ability to plant troops on Nazi-held shores. On assuming his new role, he immediately took a tour of the length of the Atlantic Wall to inspect the work that had already been done and assess its effectiveness in any upcoming battle.
Rommel was far from impressed. He knew the battle for Europe was going to be won and lost on these beaches, and the bunkers and the men here were far from up to the job. So Rommel set to his task of trying to improve these defences and make them viable for the defence of Europe.
Albert Speer remembered one particularly blunt conversation between Hitler and Rommel after his tour of the Atlantic Wall. He was critical of the design of the bunkers and said,
"We must repulse the enemy at his first landing site. The pillboxes around the ports don't do the trick. Only primitive but effective barriers and obstacles all along the coast can make the landing so difficult that our countermeasures will be effective."
Rommel continued the bunker building that Dorsch had started the previous year, but instead of spreading them across the length of the beaches, they were organised into Widerstandsnest, resistance points. This allowed the bunkers to work in concert with one another and concentrate their firepower. And Rommel started a mass project of littering Europe's beaches with those primitive barriers that he had previously mentioned to Hitler. Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates would ensure the Nazis dictated where the Allies would land if they wanted to get into Europe, and minefields would be packed into areas that were less well defended by bunkers. In Denmark alone, over 1.5 million mines were planted. The Atlantic coast was to be turned into a kill zone for invading Allied forces. In the end, Rommel had less than a year to implement his changes. On the 6th of June 1944, just 7 months after he became Inspector General, the Allies launched their attempt to liberate Europe. The Atlantic Wall would finally face its ultimate test.
The Allies, of course, would invade in Normandy, where bunkers like this and pillboxes would provide some level of defence, yet the overwhelming Allied force would eventually break through. This would be a fatal blow for Hitler and his Third Reich.
The Atlantic Wall project was fatally flawed, its scale too large, and despite the efforts of Rommel, the line of defence was just too thin to withstand an invasion on the scale of D-Day. After more than 2 years in the making, the wall was punctured in less than a day. But it's important to remember that the Allies also outthought the Germans. They didn't want to test their invasion fleet up against any of the heavily defended ports, and instead developed their ingenious Mulberry harbours, which allowed them the luxury of finding more lightly defended sectors of the Atlantic Wall to attack. Ultimately though, the effectiveness of the wall could only be tested in battle, and once it failed, there was no way back. The thousands of men and guns that were here in Denmark and in Norway, the Netherlands and Belgium, set in concrete and facing towards Britain, were rendered useless.
The Atlantic Wall failed in its primary purpose, to protect the Third Reich, but despite the best efforts of man and nature, it still stands today as a lasting monument to the Second World War.
Check out the History Hit YouTube, where you can get great exclusive videos and a sneak peek at what's available on the world's best history channel, History Hit TV. It's growing really fast. We're thrilled to have you all aboard.